You probably know when a queen burns people alive, there's usually a reason. But Mary Tudor didn't need a reason beyond her absolute conviction that she was saving souls. Over 280 men, women, and children screamed as flames consumed their bodies during her 5-year reign. She watched some of these executions herself, believing each death brought England closer to God. The woman who would become Bloody Mary didn't start as a monster. She was forged into one by betrayal, abandonment, and a religious fury that would reshape England forever. Mary's half-brother Edward VI was dying, and everyone knew it. The 15-year-old Protestant king had consumption, coughing up blood while his advisors scrambled to keep Catholics away from the throne. They had good reason to worry. Mary Tudor represented everything Edward's reign had tried to destroy. She was Catholic, legitimate, and absolutely determined to undo every Protestant reform England had seen. When Edward finally died in July 1553, the Protestant nobles made their move. They proclaimed Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, as queen instead. Jane was 16, terrified, and completely unprepared for what came next. Mary wasn't about to let them steal her birthright. She had spent years watching her father declare her illegitimate, enduring Edward's Protestant reforms, and biding her time. Now they wanted to skip over her entirely. The woman who had survived Henry VIII's rage and Edward's religious persecution gathered her supporters in East Anglia. Within days, she had an army. Jane Grey's reign lasted exactly 9 days before Mary's forces surrounded London. The city opened its gates without a fight. The moment Mary entered London, the bells rang for hours. Catholics who had hidden their faith for years openly wept in the streets. Mary had done something that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She had taken the throne from Protestant nobles and made it look easy. But this victory came with a price that would define her reign. She had to decide what to do with the people who had tried to steal her crown, and more importantly, what to do with the Protestant reforms that had torn England away from Rome. Jane Grey went to the Tower of London, along with her husband and father-in-law. Mary initially planned to spare the girl who had been used as a pawn by ambitious men. Jane was just a teenager who had been manipulated into accepting a crown she never wanted. But mercy would prove to be a luxury Mary couldn't afford. When Jane's father joined Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, Mary's advisors convinced her that leaving Jane alive was too dangerous. On February 12, 1554, Jane Grey was beheaded on Tower Green at 17 years old. Mary's path to the throne had been written in blood, but this was just the beginning. She had fought for her crown, but now she had to fight for her faith. The Protestant establishment that had tried to deny her the throne was still there, still powerful, and still determined to prevent England's return to Catholicism. Mary had won the throne, but she hadn't won the war. That would require something much more systematic than a few executions in the Tower. The first thing Mary did was hear Mass in Westminster Abbey. For the first time in over 20 years, a Catholic service was held in England's most important church. The Latin prayers echoed through the ancient stones while Protestant bishops stood frozen in the congregation. Mary's message was unmistakable. Rome was returning to England, and everyone would have to choose sides. Mary's restoration of Catholicism wasn't just about personal faith. It was about erasing her father's legacy and healing what she saw as a wound in England's soul. Henry VIII had broken with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, tearing the country away from centuries of Catholic tradition. Edward VI had pushed England even further toward Protestantism, stripping altars, destroying religious art, and forcing priests to marry. Mary looked at the England she inherited and saw a nation damned by heresy. She believed God had placed her on the throne specifically to save it. The process began immediately. Mary ordered the release of Catholic bishops who had been imprisoned under Edward VI. She restored the Latin Mass and began the complex process of returning church lands that had been seized by the Crown. Married Protestant clergy were given a choice: abandon their wives and children, or abandon their positions. Most chose their families and found themselves unemployed overnight. The Book of Common Prayer, which had been the foundation of English Protestantism, was banned. In its place, Mary brought back the old Catholic rituals that most young English people had never seen. But Mary's reforms went deeper than just changing the prayer books. She reopened the monasteries that Henry VIII had closed, though finding the money to fund them proved nearly impossible. The Crown had already sold most of the church lands to nobles who weren't eager to give them back. Mary had to negotiate with Protestant families who had grown rich from monastery lands, trying to convince them to return property they considered legally theirs. Most refused, creating a permanent tension between Mary's religious goals and political reality. The Queen also had to deal with the thousands of Protestant books that had flooded England during Edward's reign. These books, many printed in English rather than Latin, had made religious ideas accessible to ordinary people in ways that had never been possible before. Mary ordered them confiscated and burned, but the ideas they contained couldn't be destroyed so easily. A generation of English people had grown up reading the Bible in their own language, thinking about religion in ways that challenged Catholic authority. Mary could burn the books, but she couldn't unthink the thoughts they had planted. Foreign policy became inseparable from religious policy. Mary began negotiating with Rome to formally restore England to papal authority. These negotiations were complicated by the fact that English nobles still held vast amounts of former church property. The Pope wanted guarantees that these lands would be returned, but Mary knew that demanding their return would probably cause a revolt. She had to convince Rome to accept a compromise that left Protestant nobles in possession of Catholic lands. The Pope agreed, but the arrangement satisfied no one completely. Mary's most controversial religious decision was her marriage to Philip II of Spain. Philip was not only Catholic but the son of Emperor Charles V, making him one of the most powerful men in Europe. English politicians were horrified at the prospect of their queen marrying a foreign prince who might drag England into Spain's wars. Mary didn't care about their concerns. She needed a Catholic husband who could help her restore England to the faith, and Philip was the obvious choice. Their marriage treaty was signed in 1554 despite widespread opposition from Parliament and the English people. The marriage immediately triggered Wyatt's Rebellion, a Protestant uprising that nearly reached London before Mary's forces crushed it. The rebellion convinced Mary that her religious reforms faced serious opposition. Protestant nobles weren't just passively resisting her changes, they were actively plotting against her. The failed rebellion marked a turning point in Mary's reign. She began to see Protestant resistance not as political disagreement but as treason against God himself. The woman who had shown mercy to Jane Grey initially was about to show a very different side of her nature. 2 years into Mary's reign, the Queen made a decision that would stain her legacy forever. In 1555, she revived England's heresy laws, dormant since her father's time. You need to understand what this meant. These weren't modern legal proceedings with lawyers and appeals. Under these laws, anyone who refused to abandon Protestant beliefs would be declared a heretic and sentenced to death. The method? Burning alive at the stake. Mary's advisors, particularly Bishop Edmund Bonner and Cardinal Reginald Pole, pushed hard for this approach. They convinced her that half measures had failed, that only the complete elimination of Protestant thought could restore England's spiritual health. The Queen needed no convincing. She genuinely believed that every Protestant soul condemned to hell weakened England itself. To her, these executions weren't cruelty, they were surgery on a diseased nation. The machinery of persecution moved swiftly. Church courts were empowered to investigate suspected heretics. Neighbors reported neighbors. Former priests who had married during Edward's reign became prime targets, along with anyone caught with English-language Bibles or Protestant prayer books. The trials themselves were theatrical productions designed to extract public confessions and recantations. Most chilling was the systematic nature of it all. Mary didn't order random killings in fits of rage. She established a bureaucracy of death. Court officials received detailed instructions on identifying heretics. Local authorities got orders to gather wood and prepare execution sites. The Queen's government turned religious murder into administrative routine. What made Mary's approach particularly ruthless was her refusal to spare anyone. Previous monarchs had typically executed only prominent religious leaders who posed political threats. Mary targeted ordinary believers, farmers, merchants, servants, even teenagers. She understood that terror worked best when it reached into every social class. A blacksmith burning for his faith sent a message to every other blacksmith in England. The first major execution came in February 1555. John Rogers, a Protestant minister, was marched to Smithfield and burned while crowds watched. Rogers had translated parts of the Bible into English, enough to mark him for death. As flames consumed him, Mary's observers noted that he washed his hands in the fire as if it had been cold water. The Queen's campaign of religious terror had begun. Palace records show that Mary personally reviewed many execution orders. She didn't delegate this responsibility to subordinates. She made conscious choices about who would live or die based on their religious beliefs. The woman who had once been declared illegitimate by her own father now held absolute power over life and death, and she wielded it without mercy. The psychological impact on England was immediate. Protestant families began fleeing to continental Europe. Others practiced their faith in secret, knowing that discovery meant death. Mary had succeeded in driving her religious enemies underground, but she had also created an atmosphere of fear that poisoned daily life across the kingdom. The mechanics of execution by fire reveal the calculated cruelty behind Mary's religious campaign. Burning at the stake wasn't chosen randomly. It carried specific theological meaning. Fire was supposed to purify the soul, burning away heretical thoughts before death. The Church taught that this gave condemned heretics a final chance at salvation, even as their bodies were destroyed. The process began with the construction of the stake and pyre. Workers would drive a thick wooden post deep into the ground, then stack dry wood, straw, and kindling around its base. The condemned person was chained to the post, usually around the waist and neck, ensuring they couldn't escape the flames. Sometimes, if the victim recanted at the last moment, executioners would place gunpowder near their head to cause a quicker death, a twisted form of mercy. Contemporary accounts describe the horrific reality of death by burning. The fire typically started at the victim's feet and legs. Initially, the heat would cause excruciating pain as skin blistered and flesh began to char. Victims often screamed until smoke inhalation damaged their lungs and throats. The lucky ones lost consciousness quickly from carbon monoxide poisoning. Others remained aware much longer, experiencing unimaginable agony as flames climbed their bodies. Medical understanding of the time didn't grasp the full horror of what was happening. Modern forensic analysis reveals that victims typically died from a combination of factors: shock from extreme pain, carbon monoxide poisoning, thermal burns to the respiratory system, and eventual cardiac arrest. The process could take anywhere from several minutes to over an hour, depending on wind conditions, wood quality, and the victim's physical condition. Weather played a crucial role in the suffering. Rain could make wood burn slowly and unevenly, prolonging the agony. Strong winds might fan flames higher, creating more intense heat, but potentially shortening the ordeal. Executioners became grimly expert at managing these variables. Some took pity on victims and built fires designed to kill quickly. Others, particularly those who enjoyed their work, constructed pyres meant to maximize suffering. The psychological torture began long before the flames were lit. Condemned prisoners were typically held in local jails for days or weeks before execution. They could hear carpenters building their execution platform. They knew exactly what awaited them: the sounds, the smells, the progression of pain. Many spent their final nights writing letters to family members, knowing these words would be their last earthly communication. The public nature of these executions was entirely intentional. Mary's government wanted maximum visibility for Protestant deaths. Market squares and town centers became killing grounds precisely because they drew the largest crowds. The Queen's message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy the true faith. Every execution was both a death and a warning, calculated to terrorize potential religious dissidents into submission. The condemned faced their deaths with extraordinary courage, leaving behind testimonies that would outlast Mary's reign. John Hooper, Bishop of Gloucester, wrote his final letter with hands that would soon be consumed by flames. His words reveal a man at peace with approaching agony. "I go to my death gladly, for I know that my Redeemer liveth." Hooper's execution was particularly brutal. The wood was green and burned slowly, prolonging his suffering for over an hour. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, burned together at Oxford, created one of the most famous martyrdom scenes in English history. As flames began to rise, Latimer called out to his fellow victim, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." These weren't the words of broken men. They were declarations of defiance that transformed government executions into religious victories. Joan Waste, a blind rope maker from Derby, showed remarkable composure when sentenced to burn. She had learned scripture by listening to others read aloud, memorizing vast portions of the Protestant Bible. When offered a chance to save her life by converting to Catholicism, she replied, "I will not turn from God for the fear of man." Her disability made her execution particularly shocking to observers. Mary's government was willing to burn even the most vulnerable members of society. The most heartbreaking testimonies came from married clergy who faced execution for refusing to abandon their wives. Under Catholic law, priests couldn't marry, so Protestant ministers who had wed during Edward VI's reign were considered to be living in sin. Many chose death rather than declare their marriages invalid. Their letters described the agony of leaving behind wives and children, but also expressed certainty that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. Anne Askew, tortured on the rack before her execution, had to be carried to the stake because her bones were broken. Even in extreme physical distress, she managed to dictate letters that circulated throughout Protestant Europe. Her writings describe a woman who found spiritual strength in the midst of unimaginable suffering. She wrote, "I will not curse my tormentors, for they know not what they do." Protestant chroniclers like John Foxe collected these testimonies systematically, understanding their propaganda value. However, even accounting for possible exaggeration, the pattern remains clear. Mary's victims generally faced death with remarkable dignity. Their composed final words and peaceful demeanor at execution sites created a powerful counter-narrative to the Queen's campaign of terror. These martyrs understood the political implications of their deaths. They knew their courage would be remembered, their letters preserved, their examples used to strengthen Protestant resistance. In many ways, they transformed Mary's executions from government victories into religious defeats. Every calm death, every peaceful final prayer, every dignified march to the stake undermined the Queen's authority and strengthened the cause she was trying to destroy. The flames that consumed over 280 souls didn't just burn bodies, they ignited something far more dangerous for Mary's reign. Public opinion began to turn, and not just among Protestants. Catholics who had initially supported their Queen's holy mission started questioning whether salvation required quite this much screaming. You have to understand the psychology of witnessing public executions in Tudor England. These weren't hidden affairs conducted in palace dungeons. Mary deliberately staged these burnings in town squares, marketplaces, anywhere crowds could gather. She wanted maximum visibility for maximum impact. The problem with public spectacles is that you can't control how people interpret what they're seeing. Contemporary accounts reveal the growing unease. Even Catholic citizens who agreed with Mary's religious goals found themselves disturbed by the sheer volume of smoke and ash accumulating in their town centers. One London merchant wrote that the smell of burning flesh had become so common that it lingered in the marketplace for days after each execution. People stopped bringing their children to watch. That should have been Mary's first warning sign. The turning point came when pregnant women started appearing at the stakes. English society, regardless of religious affiliation, held deep cultural taboos about harming expectant mothers. When Mary's commissioners ordered the execution of a woman who was visibly carrying a child, even some Catholic nobles began expressing private doubts. Palace records show that several court officials requested transfers to other duties rather than oversee these particular executions. But the real damage to Mary's support came from an unexpected source: the victims themselves. These weren't cowards begging for mercy or renouncing their faith to save their lives. They were singing hymns as the flames reached their feet. They were forgiving their executioners with their final breaths. They were dying with a dignity that made their persecutors look like monsters. Word spread quickly through England's tight-knit communities. Protestant networks already skilled at operating underground began documenting these executions in detail. They distributed accounts of martyrs who faced death with courage while the Queen's men fumbled with wet wood and poorly constructed pyres. The intended message of royal authority became a demonstration of Protestant moral superiority. Mary's own advisors began expressing concerns about the political wisdom of continuing the burnings. Letters from Spanish ambassador Simon Renard reveal that even Philip II's court was questioning whether the English Queen was taking religious restoration too far. When your closest Catholic allies start worrying about your methods, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The economic impact added another layer of resentment. Public executions disrupted trade, required significant resources, and created an atmosphere of fear that made foreign merchants reluctant to conduct business in English ports. Towns that had initially welcomed the return of Catholic authority now associated it with the constant disruption of normal life. By 1557, attendance at public burnings had dropped significantly. People weren't staying away because they disagreed with Catholic doctrine. They were staying away because watching their neighbors burn alive had become unbearable, regardless of the theological justification. Mary had intended to create a spectacle of divine justice. Instead, she had created a spectacle of human cruelty that would haunt England's collective memory long after the last fire was extinguished. The very public nature of her campaign became its greatest weakness, turning potential supporters into silent opponents and transforming religious persecution into a public relations disaster that would define her entire reign. 5 years of flames left more than just bodies in their wake. They left a legacy written in smoke and seared into England's soul. Mary's campaign to save her nation's spirit had accomplished something she never intended. It transformed Protestant martyrdom into the most powerful recruiting tool her enemies could have asked for. The mathematical horror speaks for itself. 284 people reduced to ash and bone. That's roughly one execution every 6.5 days for 5 straight years. but numbers can't capture the psychological impact of watching an entire generation of religious leaders, ordinary citizens, and even pregnant women systematically eliminated in town squares across England. What Mary had envisioned as spiritual surgery became spiritual trauma. Each execution was meant to demonstrate the consequences of religious defiance. Instead, they demonstrated something far more dangerous to royal authority, that ordinary people could die for their beliefs with more dignity than nobles could live for their privileges. The Protestant community didn't just survive this persecution, they weaponized it. Underground networks began treating Mary's victims as saints before their bodies had even cooled. Stories of miraculous courage spread faster than official proclamations. A blacksmith who refused to renounce his faith became more famous than the bishops who condemned him. An elderly woman who sang hymns while flames consumed her dress became a folk hero whose story would be retold for generations. Mary's campaign created the exact opposite of what she intended. Rather than crushing Protestant resistance, she had handed them a propaganda victory that would echo through centuries. Every execution became evidence that Catholics were willing to murder innocent people for the crime of reading the Bible in English. Every funeral pyre became a recruitment poster for the emerging Protestant identity. The long-term consequences extended far beyond religion. Mary's reign convinced many English subjects that their monarchs were capable of monstrous acts when motivated by foreign religious authorities. The Spanish influence on her policies, combined with the continental European approach to religious warfare, made her appear less English and more like an occupying force. When Elizabeth I assumed the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom where religious tolerance had become a survival strategy rather than a moral choice. The English had learned that religious extremism led to neighbors burning neighbors, families divided by theological disputes, and entire communities living in fear of denunciation. Elizabeth's relatively moderate approach to religious diversity wasn't just enlightened politics, it was a direct response to the trauma Mary had inflicted on the national psyche. The fires Mary lit in market squares across England inadvertently forged the beginnings of English Protestant national identity. Her victims became the founding martyrs of a religious movement that would eventually define English resistance to Catholic continental powers for centuries. The Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot, the eventual English Civil War, all of these conflicts carried the psychological DNA of Mary's persecution. Mary died believing she had begun England's spiritual restoration. History would record that she had actually accelerated its spiritual transformation in the opposite direction. The queen who thought she was saving souls had created a legacy measured in screams, smoke, and the unbreakable conviction that religious freedom was worth dying for. Her 5-year reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism, but not in the way she intended. It became proof that persecution creates martyrs, martyrs create movements, and movements can outlast the monarchs who try to destroy them. The nickname that would define Mary Tudor for the next 5 centuries wasn't coined by her enemies, it was earned through calculated brutality and sealed with the screams of 284 human beings who refused to abandon their faith. But calling her Bloody Mary actually lets her off easy. The label suggests a kind of medieval barbarism, a throwback to cruder times when religious violence was simply how things were done. This comfortable distance allows us to dismiss Mary as a relic of a more savage age. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Mary's persecution was methodical, bureaucratic, and thoroughly modern in its systematic approach to eliminating religious dissent. Mary didn't earn her nickname through passionate outbursts or medieval-style dungeon tortures. She earned it through paperwork. Her administration developed efficient processes for identifying, trying, and executing heretics. They created standardized procedures for public burnings. They established quotas and timelines for religious purification. This wasn't the work of a mad tyrant. It was the work of a competent administrator who happened to believe that burning people alive served the greater good. The Bloody Mary moniker also obscures the calculated nature of her choices. Every execution required royal approval. Mary personally reviewed cases, signed death warrants, and made conscious decisions about who would live and who would burn. She wasn't a puppet controlled by Catholic advisors or Spanish influence. She was an intelligent woman who genuinely believed that eternal damnation represented a worse fate than temporary agony in market square flames. Understanding Mary's true motivations makes her actions more horrifying, not less. A crazy tyrant killing people for personal gratification is a monster. A devout ruler killing people to save their souls is something far more dangerous. A person who has convinced themselves that cruelty serves compassion. The nickname has also allowed historians to avoid grappling with uncomfortable parallels to other systematic persecutions throughout history. Mary's methodical approach to religious cleansing shares disturbing similarities with later genocides and political purges. The administrative efficiency, the public spectacle designed to terrorize compliance, the careful documentation of each victim's final moments, these elements appear again and again in humanity's darkest chapters. But focusing on Mary's personal bloodthirstiness misses the broader institutional machinery that made her persecution possible. The bishops who identified heretics, the commissioners who conducted trials, the executioners who lit the fires, the crowds who gathered to watch Mary's reign revealed how quickly ordinary people can become complicit in systematic cruelty when it's presented as moral necessity. The Bloody Mary legend has also overshadowed the voices of her victims. Reducing Mary to a historical villain transforms the people she killed into props in her story, rather than individuals with their own beliefs, families, and reasons for choosing death over conversion. John Rogers, the first Protestant burned under Mary's reign, was a "You think Mary Tudor was just a bloodthirsty queen who enjoyed watching people burn?" The reality is infinitely more complicated. While 280 corpses smoldered across England, Mary wasn't operating in a vacuum. She was a player in the deadliest game Europe had ever seen, where entire kingdoms rose and fell based on whether you said Mass in Latin or English. The year 1553 wasn't just another year in Tudor England. Across the continent, Catholics and Protestants were literally tearing each other apart. The German states had been bleeding for decades through religious wars that made Mary's persecution look like a neighborhood dispute. In France, Huguenots and Catholics were sharpening their knives for what would become a civil war so brutal it would make the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre look restrained. Mary wasn't inventing religious persecution, she was importing it. Her closest advisor, Cardinal Reginald Pole, had spent years in Rome watching the Catholic Counter-Reformation take shape. This wasn't some gentle theological discussion over tea and biscuits. The Catholic Church was fighting for its very survival, and Pole had absorbed every lesson about how to crush heresy before it could spread. When he whispered in Mary's ear about the necessity of fire and sword, he was reciting strategies that had been refined in the killing fields of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Mary's cousin, wasn't just sending her congratulations when she took the throne. His agents were actively coordinating with her advisors, sharing intelligence about Protestant networks and providing tactical support for her religious campaign. This was international warfare disguised as domestic policy. Every Protestant burned in Smithfield sent a message to reformers in Amsterdam, Geneva, and Wittenberg that the Catholic Restoration was deadly serious. Mary's most terrifying decisions weren't made in isolation. Her Privy Council included men who had watched Protestant mobs destroy Catholic shrines during Edward's reign. They had seen centuries of religious art smashed, monasteries gutted, and priests driven into hiding. When they advised Mary to revive the heresy laws, they weren't just protecting their faith, they were settling scores written in broken glass and desecrated altars. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Mary's reign coincided with the Council of Trent, where the Catholic Church was systematically defining what constituted heresy worth dying for. Every theological position that Protestant reformers had embraced was being methodically condemned by church authorities. Mary wasn't just killing English Protestants, she was enforcing papal policy with English fire. Even her marriage to Philip II of Spain wasn't a romantic choice. It was a strategic alliance in a continental religious war. Philip brought Spanish gold and expertise in managing religious minorities. The Spanish Inquisition had been perfecting techniques for identifying and eliminating heretics for decades. Mary's persecution methods bore striking similarities to Spanish practices, right down to the ceremonial aspects of public executions. The broader context makes Mary's actions more understandable, but infinitely more chilling. She wasn't a lone fanatic. She was part of a coordinated Catholic response to Protestant expansion. Every decision was calculated. Every execution served a larger strategic purpose. The woman who earned the nickname Bloody Mary was following a playbook written in Rome and endorsed by every major Catholic power in Europe. Mary Tudor died in 1558, but her legacy refuses to stay buried. 5 centuries later, we still argue about whether she was a religious zealot or a misunderstood monarch trying to save England's soul. The truth is neither simple nor comfortable. Her reign reveals the terrifying power of absolute conviction. Mary genuinely believed that every Protestant she burned was actually being saved from eternal damnation. In her mind, the temporary agony of flames was merciful compared to the endless torment awaiting heretics in hell. She saw herself as a spiritual surgeon, cutting out infected tissue to save the body of England. The screams echoing from Smithfield were proof of her devotion, not her cruelty. Yet this same devotion produced consequences that haunted English Christianity for generations. The graphic accounts of Protestant martyrs, particularly from John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, became foundational texts for English Protestant identity. Mary's fires didn't extinguish the Reformation, they forged it into something harder and more enduring. Every mother who watched her neighbors burn stored that memory in her heart and passed it to her children. Protestant England was literally born from the ashes of Mary's victims. The numbers tell their own story about her complex legacy. More people died for their faith during Mary's 5-year reign than during the entire 38-year reign of Henry VIII. She compressed a lifetime of religious violence into a concentrated burst of persecution that left permanent scars on English memory. The efficiency of her killing reveals both her administrative competence and her moral blindness. Mary's tragedy lies in the gap between her intentions and her results. She wanted to heal England's spiritual wounds, but every execution deepened the religious divide she was trying to bridge. Catholic subjects who initially supported her restoration grew increasingly uncomfortable as the body count mounted. Protestant subjects who might have been converted through persuasion were instead driven into underground resistance. Her harsh methods produced exactly the opposite of what she intended. Modern historians struggle with Mary's legacy because she defies simple categorization. She was simultaneously a victim of her circumstances and an architect of unprecedented brutality. Her childhood trauma from being declared illegitimate, her isolated years under Protestant rule, and her desperate need to vindicate her mother's memory all contributed to her ruthless pursuit of Catholic restoration. Understanding her motivations doesn't excuse her actions, but it makes them tragically human. The most disturbing aspect of Mary's legacy isn't that she killed so many people, it's that she killed them with such genuine conviction. Evil that knows itself is one thing, but evil that believes itself righteous is infinitely more dangerous. Mary Tudor wasn't a monster, she was something worse, a true believer with absolute power. Her complex legacy serves as a permanent warning about the deadly intersection of faith and politics, conviction and cruelty, salvation and slaughter.